So good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And welcome to Tangible's webinar series on all things cybersecurity. So our goal with this series is to help organizations to keep up with and understand the rapidly evolving changes in this digital landscape that we find ourselves. So today's topic is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0. And many of you may be familiar with the NIST CSF, as it's called, and know that it provides a structured approach to managing cybersecurity risk. However, they've made some changes recently to the framework. And so today we'll highlight what those changes are and how they may impact an organization as they develop and mature their security program. So before we get started, just some few housekeeping items. My name is Terence McCarthy, and I'm the Regional Director for Tangible for the East here. So I'll be emceeing the webinar today. The webinar itself will be about 40 minutes long, and we leave about 20 minutes or so for questions and answers at the end. All participants will be muted during the session. Any questions that you have, please submit them in the chat function or chat feature, and we'll answer them at the end. So slides will be distributed after the session, and this recording will be made available to everybody on our website. And then finally, today's session is being recorded. Okay, so a little bit about our speakers. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, and it's Anthony Bolan, and he's actually Tangible Security's CISO, our Chief Information Security Officer. So briefly, just to give you some background on Anthony, he's a 17-year veteran with experience in building and managing security programs. And he's not only an expert in compliance, but he also has a background in offensive penetration testing. So this is actually a pretty rare skill set combination. And he not only understands compliance, but he also understands how adversaries attack organizations, systems, and applications. So Anthony is passionate about security strategy, building security programs, incident response, and of course, penetration testing. So as I mentioned, he currently serves as Tangible Security's Chief Information Security Officer, but he also heads up our governance, risk and management and compliance advisory service practice as well, which keeps him very busy. So in addition to that, he's a practicing CISO for many of our clients, right? So including a publicly traded pharmaceutical manufacturer and a blockchain-based platform developer. So a lot of broad experience there as well, bringing to this conversation. Anthony holds numerous industry certifications and is well respected in the industry. So with that being said, it's time to sit back, relax, and get ready to learn about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0. Anthony, I'll pass it over to you.
All right, thanks, Terence. I appreciate it. Well, again, hello, everyone. Thank you. Let's go ahead and dive right in. So for those who may be a little less familiar with the cybersecurity framework as a whole, we'll start with just a little bit of an introduction here on what it is. And so its purpose is to provide guidance and best practices, focusing mostly on cybersecurity risk management, but it is very broad in what it covers and acts as a very solid base for the development of cybersecurity programs as a whole. It's a useful tool for looking for areas of strength within an organization, for finding areas for enhancement, as well as defining focuses and prioritizing different areas to be developed into projects. It is mandatory for U.S. federal agencies. It's not officially mandatory for generally anyone else, although certain government associated industries and corporations may have more of a strong interest in it than others, but it's been widely adopted by organizations worldwide because of its strong foundations for security programs. It's an extremely useful and widely appreciated model, and the 2.0 release is something that I personally had been long awaiting. It originated out of one of President Obama's executive orders way back in 2013, originally focused around critical infrastructure. And so the framework itself was originally called the Framework for Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity. That was released back in 2014, and it kept that name, although it was colloquially known as the Cybersecurity Framework for a long time. The 2.0 release officially now just calls it the Cybersecurity Framework, which goes to show just how much it's expanded over time. We had the 1.1 release in 2018, and then just here at the end of February, we had 2.0. And so, continuing onward, we'll go ahead and talk about a summary of the changes in the framework before we dive into more detail. And so, as you can see here, anyone who's familiar with the older versions of the framework, you'll see that in the center of our little chart there, we have a new function. It's no longer just the 5 around the outside. We have govern in the center, acting as our hub, a connective, kind of a connective piece to take all of these different functions and unite them. The idea is to take all of these assorted GRC elements, put them into a single function, show the importance of it by centering it within this diagram and not just adding it in as one of these other side elements. And it also shows a very big focus on supply chain and third-party risk management. The implementation tiers have been revised and are now just called the CSF tiers, and they're more formally intended for use as an actual maturity model. Generally, before they were seen as kind of they were seen as stepping stones, different levels that organizations could pursue, and that is still the case, but NIST always went back and forth with previous versions on whether you should really look at it as kind of, a maturity model that you take improvements on, level by level as opposed to broader recommendations. And so it's nice to see that they've done that. There are now implementation examples for each one of the subcategories with examples showing demonstrations of what each one of these pieces represents. What is it that is recommended for each subcategory? Again, anyone familiar with the older versions know that some of them could be very vague in their wording and rather confusing. And so these examples make it much more understandable to people who haven't worked with it as extensively. We also have organizational profiles, which make it much easier to demonstrate both the current and planned level of cybersecurity maturity for an organization. We'll dive into that in more detail shortly as well. And I would say in many ways, most importantly, there are a wide range now of self-assessment tools, quick start guides, and community profiles, which we'll talk about as well, to make the framework much easier to use than it was previously. There's extensive information out there now, and the community is continuing to build out these new profiles and provide more, and it's really great to see because it's going to make this much more accessible to a broader base of people. And so let's go ahead and start with organizational profiles because, again, I see this as one of the major elements here. They started as framework profiles in 1.0. They weren't heavily used in terms of being shared across different elements of industry, but the community profile model that we have now is making this much more common. If you look at NIST's website, there's already a couple dozen of them out there. But so what an organizational profile is fundamentally is it's a section of the controls. It can either be a subset of the framework that can be tailored for a specific purpose, or it can be a list of all of these different subcategories, what the organization is currently doing to address them, what their current outcomes are within that sense. So what exactly is it you're doing to address what the subcategory is asking for, and how well are you doing it? As well as a target profile, which says, what are you looking to do? Based upon the information you're trying to protect and how you can protect it, what are you striving for? And so community profiles are released by different organizations, different sectors, and they provide specific guidance for different industries or for, again, different subsets there. For example, ransomware, there's actually multiple profiles that focus on that. And so what that will do is provide information as a target profile where you can examine your current controls and say, all right, so what do I need to do to address this threat? And by implementing the information that's given within those community profiles, you'll be able to address that, mitigate risk, and improve the overall cybersecurity of your organization. I'll also talk just briefly about the CSF tiers. They've been simplified a bit from their original state as the NIST implementation tiers. Again, anyone familiar with that model who's taken a dive into the document knows that there was an awful lot of language there. It's now much simpler. The chart on it in the new guide is much smaller and much easier to understand. So it's a welcome improvement. There are two main areas that it focuses on, risk governance and risk management. And so we have the same 4 tiers that we did previously. it goes from partial all the way up to adaptive. And just to briefly describe these for those who may be less familiar, at a partial level, management is generally ad hoc. There's limited controls and processes in place. An organization that's just getting started that doesn't really have a security program is probably going to be at this level. At tier 2, we have risk informed, where some practices may be in place. The organization has an idea of, well, yeah, we should probably be doing something to address cybersecurity, but things may be very informal. There may not be a lot of written policy. Things may still be done in kind of a limited fashion. By the time you reach tier 3, repeatable, you have formal policy and practice in place. You have risk assessment of some sort being conducted to actually define what the cybersecurity program should be doing, and you have consistent controls of some kind, be they technical, administrative, whatever it is, to actually secure the environment. And then in adaptive, you have risk being managed through all levels of the organization. There is an understanding from executive management, the board of directors, all the way down of the importance of cybersecurity. You have real-time information coming in on assorted metrics, methods of detection for possible events, and the organization is continually improving its program. All right, and so let's go ahead and start diving into the sections here in a little more detail. So first of all, govern. Well, what's new? I mean, it's a new function, but not everything here is actually brand new. We've seen some of this before, but again, it serves as the hub of the wheel of all of this, binding everything together. And we had elements of this originally as a governance category in the identify function previously, but it combines some new elements as well as some old ones. There's a lot of things that were formerly in the identify section that have been moved here. The business environment pieces have now tied into an overview of the organization. Governance, of course, itself has been integrated. Elements of risk assessment as well as supply chain risk management has been taken out of identify and greatly expanded. There are a few pieces from the detect and protect categories, largely around roles and responsibilities, that have also been moved into govern. And it focuses heavily on stakeholder involvement, strategic direction and communication, and of course, as I had mentioned, expands dramatically on supply chains risk management. And so to look at what that is in a little more detail, the way NIST defines this is the organization's cybersecurity risk management strategy, expectations, and policy are established, communicated, and monitored. What this really means, quite simply, is how does the organization address risk? And this is an area where we've seen a lot of difficulty with clients that we've worked with in determining this. Organizational culture can sometimes be an issue. You have to have management buy-in in order to actually implement a lot of these elements. And there's an increasing need to evaluate the cybersecurity programs of third parties. And so NIST has now done that through this organization within these elements, starting with the organizational context. So what's the organization's mission? What are its business objectives? What obligations does it have both for industry regulations, legal obligations, and what are its dependencies? Who does it have to work with as its third parties? What does it need to do in order to, and who does it have to rely on to protect its information? And then for risk management strategy, this again is the organization's overall priorities. What is its risk tolerance and risk appetite? What is the organization willing to accept internally as a potential risk? What does it need to mitigate? And what can it transfer away with insurance? And then we have the roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Again, someone has to do this work. Someone has to be implementing all of these controls and providing those protections. And so those need to be well defined, and there has to be accountability within the organization. And the program has to be continuously improved, so that also needs to be defined. And then, of course, policy, everyone's favorite, which is the documentation of these requirements, putting it all into a written form so that it can be known across the organization, so that new people who are coming in can see it, they can understand it, and they can, from there, train themselves and be integrated into the organization's culture and requirements. And then we have oversight. What's actually going on? How are things being improved over time? How is the program being assessed to determine if it is improving? And then finally, yet again, cybersecurity supply chain risk management. Are you assessing these same things of your third parties who are storing critical information? And what does that look like? What is your process? And so moving on now into the identify function. It's been heavily simplified and streamlined. There's now a focus within this section on understanding assets. So this includes hardware, software, and data. And so the asset management category includes a wide range of elements here, from the protect category now, combining elements of the lifecycle into a single unified place. This is everything from defining, how are you keeping an inventory of your hardware, but also things like data flow diagrams. How are you securely deleting information? How are you backing it up? All of that now falls under this section. The risk assessment category is now also broader than it previously was, providing a fuller view of risk, threat, and vulnerabilities, all as kind of one piece, and looking at how threat and vulnerability incorporate to become risk. It also includes elements for change control as well, how the organization is addressing risk as its program is changing over time. And then there's now an improvement category, which takes all of these formerly disparate elements across all of the different sections and focuses it in here to say, how are you identifying that the program is improving? Not what's your methodology previously, but this now says, what does that actually look like? What is your demonstration of the improvement? And so in a little more detail here, the way NIST phrases this one is the organization's current cybersecurity risks are understood. What we're fundamentally asking here is, what is the organization seeking to protect? And so again, we have asset management. How are you keeping all of this information stored? How are you showing the diagrams? How do you know, where your PII is going within the environment? How is that documented? And then within risk assessment, how are you managing your vulnerabilities and threats? How are you determining your risks? Do you have a documented risk register? Do you have a business impact analysis showing your critical systems and recovery time objectives, things of that nature? And then for the improvement, what evaluations are you using to show improvements of the program? And this is an area where we see, again, difficulty for, I would say, smaller organizations, startups. A lot of organizations don't really know where to start, and the short answer is here. What are your risks? What are the threats and vulnerabilities? What are you worried about? What keeps you up at night? Where is your data? Start documenting these things out, and that gives you a solid basis to then say, now I know what I'm trying to protect, and then you can figure out how to protect it. And so for the protect section, it hasn't changed as much as the first two. There are new names for different functions. Core ideas are still largely the same, although the categories here are fewer and broader. They're also less prescriptive, and this is true across the entire CSF. Formerly, we had a lot of things, including items that may not directly apply to an organization directly. I recall one, I think that was in, I think it's in the response category. Forensics are performed was the way it was phrased, and most organizations, at least smaller ones especially, are not going to be doing their own digital forensics. And so, that was a question that we always interpreted to say, what does your cybersecurity insurance look like? What are your response capabilities for that if needed? But some of the specific phrasing and different elements was not broadly applicable. And so now things have been worded in a much more inclusive way. And we have the implementation examples to provide that guidance with these less prescriptive controls to still provide a way for people to move forward to show, what the intent is without having to phrase things in these very narrow ways. And so protection covers 5 major areas now. We have logical and physical access. So again, this is everything from Active directory groups, roles and permissions within AWS, whatever the case may be, but also things like your key cards, keys, however you access buildings, things of that nature. Awareness and training, which is absolutely crucial. We'll talk about that a little further as we go on too. Protection of data, data loss prevention systems, data classification, development security, the entire SDLC practice, management of that through its entire life cycle, code review, testing, analysis, and then infrastructure security from everything from secure management and profiles of servers to firewall configuration rules, the whole gamut. And so the way they phrase this here is safeguards to manage the organization's cybersecurity risks are used, which, that by itself does make sense. But yeah, how is the organization mitigating risk to its assets? And so, again, as we talked about for some of these, what are the limitations on access? What types of credentials are being used? Are they appropriate? If this is multi-factor, this is biometrics, this is all of these elements, this is, passwordless solutions as well. And then for awareness and training, across the organization, what knowledge is there of cybersecurity risk? What do people understand and how do they respond? For data security, how are we ensuring the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data when it's at rest, when it's moving through our environment, and when it's being used? How are we developing our hardware and software? How are we making our products that are how do we ensure that they're in compliance with regulations and with industry best practices? And how are we making sure that our systems and networks are secure, that we're sure that people aren't getting into them, that our data isn't being altered, and that they are up as we need them to be up? And I do want to go back and just talk a little bit here about the awareness and training piece a little bit too, because this is a critical element, especially for anyone we have here who may be, again, like I said, part of a newer or a smaller company. Getting this implemented can sometimes be difficult because a lot of the training programs out there, videos can sometimes feel rather stodgy. It can be difficult to get people invested, but it is important, and it's an element of organizational culture that has to be changed over time. Way back years ago when I was working for a university, I was starting to develop some of our first phishing tests as a requirement under PCI. And I developed a couple of templates and then presented all of this over to one of the managers of the PCI program and said, all right, we have all this, we need to start testing people. And the response that I got back was, well, I don't know that we should be doing this. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, which, at the time I thought was a very odd response. But I do understand that more now, but I also understand that this is representative of a culture that needed to be changed within the organization to have the understanding that that's not what security is about, that we're not trying to catch people and point them out and say, ha, you failed. The idea is to identify those areas where there needs to be improvement within the organization, and that includes its people. And you do have to be careful about that, and organizational culture in some places can be perhaps a little bit too strict on this, but the idea is to help people improve, not to punish them. And I've seen these similar cultural examples as an issue in other places I've worked. I worked for a broker-dealer for a couple of years, and the development team, or at least an element of them, was openly hostile toward the security team. They didn't like the types of controls we were putting in place. One developer even famously telling our security manager, we'll say expletive security, which it's like, again, it's just a cultural mindset and a shift that has to be made. The idea, again, is to act as a facilitator. And so when we put in these controls, that's something that we have to think about. How do we implement them in a way that benefits the business, that fits with workflows, and is ideally not exceptionally disruptive? All right, and so moving on. So detect, respond, and recover haven't really changed as much as the other categories. Their core focuses are still largely the same as they were. We'll dive into exactly what those are here in a little bit, but again, much like we saw with Protect, the subcategories are now a lot less prescriptive. There's a wider range of control implementations that make sense within these contexts. You're not looking for something quite as specific when you're doing, for example, gap analysis, and you still have all of those implementation examples to guide you. And so within these different functions, there are a few specific things that have been done. We have event analysis and cyber intelligence, threat intelligence being added under Detect. Within Respond, there's more of a focus on identification of criteria for determining if an incident is occurring and an assessment of the impact of that incident. Recovery had some larger expansions as well to cover the methodology of the actual recovery program. Excuse me. Verification of the integrity of your backups, as well as verification that your recovery was actually successful. And so within Detect, the new phrasing for the category, or excuse me, the function is possible cybersecurity attacks and compromises that should read are found and analyzed. And so how does the organization find anomalies that could represent an active threat? How do you know that somebody is attacking you? How do you know that somebody is trying to steal your data? And so we do this through continuous monitoring. This is, how are you doing your ongoing search, not just at points in time, but how are you doing this continuously to identify these anomalies, potential indicators of compromise within your environment, or other adverse events that could be representative of a threat? And then how are you investigating those? How do you determine if it is an actual active threat? What's your methodology for that? Visibility of data is extremely important here. This is where things, for example, like a SIM solution or more broadly security orchestration tools come into play and can be very useful. For organizations that don't have the internal capability for that, this is where partner organizations, MSSPs, can be very handy because it gathers all of that information, consolidates it, and makes it visible. You can't protect what you can't see. That's really the core of the Detect function and what it's trying to do. And then for Respond, our core here, as it says, is actions regarding a detected cybersecurity incident are taken. So we have these events, we have this active threat. What do we do about it? And so this is management of the incident. What does your plan look like to stop this? How are you coordinating that? And then how are you analyzing it as well? What is your methodology for that? How are you investigating this? How are you assessing it? How are you determining what the impact is? How are you prioritizing this? If, heaven forbid, you have multiple incidents, what do you address, how and when? And then you have reporting and communication. How are you documenting what's happening so that you can go back and review it later to find areas for potential improvement to your program so that the impact of an incident is lessened in the future? How are you providing information to your stakeholders? How are you telling your customers, your students, your patients, whatever the case may be, about what's going on and how it affects them? And then how are you mitigating the incident? Now that it's had its impact, how are you preventing that from spreading? How are you doing triage on it? And how are you going to plan your initial recovery? And this section is critically important as well for an organization to develop and to have plans on early. Again, going back to the university, a number of years ago when I was working there, I had just become the first and at the time only security analyst for the just beginning security program. We had a near breach event. Fortunately, it wasn't an actual breach, but university of 20,000 students, roughly 2,000 faculty and staff, one trained incident responder. I guess, well, there was also our CISO, but he was more focused on some other elements. But I will say that's why you need to have it early. You need to have plans defined because you'll find that if you are without them, when something happens, it is very difficult to respond, and you will not respond quickly enough, unfortunately. So having all of this in advance, having playbooks that you can follow, for example, if it's a ransomware event, being able to point to it and say, all right, here's what I need to do right now, and run through step by step will save you so much time. It will save the organization money. It will save you an immense amount of headache. And then on to recover. So NIST defines this as assets and operations affected by a cybersecurity incident are restored. And so, in short, how does the organization return to its normal operations after there's an active threat? With many incidents, there can be some fairly extensive damage. Again, with ransomware, I mean, machines probably have to be re-imaged. That can take a lot of time if there's been a lot of spread. If information was taken, from the organization distributed, how are you going to ensure the the ongoing safety against identity theft of people whose information was stolen? How do you rebuild public trust? And so this section then covers, again, that methodology, the documentation behind that, and plans for the recovery of these operations. And then also the communication, as I'd mentioned, what are you going to tell people if there is information that's taken? And again, what are you reaching out? What do your messages look like in order to restore that sense of confidence? And this is something that I've seen to be overlooked within a number of organizations that I've worked with within their planning. And I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to run a number of tabletop exercises for organizations covering both business continuity operations as well as incident response. And it's something that until an organization is presented with that threat, either hypothetically or in actuality, a lot of times there just hasn't been a lot of effort put into that. And it can be rather sobering, to see, what that potential impact can be. And knowing that you're prepared in advance, much like, when you're going through the incident itself, will save you a lot of time and headache. You'll be able to restore the operations. Again, it saves money, it saves time, it makes everything considerably easier. But with that, that's the core of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, the different sections, and a little bit of my opinions on some of these sections and their importance. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it back over to Terrence and to our audience to go ahead and ask any questions that you may have at this time.
Yeah, that was great, Anthony. Thank you. A lot of good information in there. I'm sure we will have lots of questions. Again, just a reminder to submit the questions in the chat feature of the teams here. However, before we move to the Q&A session, let me just pause for a moment and share a little bit about how we at Tangible help our clients, not only with NIST, but with other security challenges that they have. So I think we're all aware that security is a journey, not really a destination, right? We never actually arrive at a completely secure state, but we can take steps to mitigate the risk of being breached and minimize the impact of an event like that when it occurs, because it will happen. It's a matter of if, but not when. So, Tangible Security, we're a full service security consulting firm, and we partner with our clients to help them on their journey. And we do that by helping them clarify what can be complex security and regulatory frameworks, like we did today, right? By helping them to develop a roadmap to a security maturity state that is right for their business. It's not one size fits all, right? It depends on what you're doing and other criteria. We then validate and help them test that program to make sure it's operational. And in the event that there's an incident, we're there to help them respond. So in fact, if you look at what you're seeing, you'll notice that our services map to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and really address just best practices across all of the pillars that Anthony just went through. So if you'd like additional information on how we may be able to assist you, please reach out to your account manager or send us an inquiry into our info@tangiblesecurity email, and we'll be happy to help you on your journey. Okay, that being said, let's start off with, and we have a question. So the first question is, Anthony, does the Cybersecurity Framework or CSF only apply to critical infrastructure companies?
Not at all, especially now that we have the 2.0 release. The framework started with that as its initial focus, but it quickly grew beyond that. Again, it was found to be a very reliable base for building out cybersecurity programs across basically any industry, both public and private sector, nonprofit, anything that you could imagine. And so it quickly grew wings and has become far more important than just a framework for critical infrastructure. It's useful for everyone.
Gotcha. Yeah, and that makes sense. So a follow-on question to that is this CFS, is it really for less mature companies just beginning to develop their security program?
It's useful for them, but again, it's useful for everyone in that sense too. When you have an organization that is more developed, you can still use it to determine where there could be areas for enhancement. When you look across the entire range of these functions and the subcategories, it's quite likely that something will be overlooked if you're not using a comprehensive model already, either something like the NIST CSF or the ISO 27000 series. And so following that same methodology will still identify those areas and allow you to push further. And even if you have a security program that is comprehensive across those areas, if you've reached that level, you can still push for an adaptive state across more of these subcategories, these controls, so that your organization is as secure as you can possibly make it, so that you are making your organization a paragon of cybersecurity.
Gotcha. So it's applicable for larger organizations, even organizations that are more mature and not just starting their journey, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay. So one of the questions popped up in the QA. So just a reminder, please post them in the chat. But another question that came from somebody is, do you have any recommendations measuring KPIs or KRIs against risk controls?
Sure. Let me think about that for just a moment. I think, the approach that I would take with that is, again, look at the control against the elements of the NIST CSF tiers. Look at how you're matching against that, where those actual differences and gaps are, and then in terms of the performance indicators, you can identify, as you're looking through your projects, well, how far away are we from this? You can kind of break it out not just to, all right, we haven't reached this tier, but look at how far your projects are moving along, how things are going, and you can develop them from that.
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Okay, another question we have is there a way to be certified for NIST, or do you get NIST CSF certified?
So there isn't an actual certification model for NIST. Unlike on the ISO side, where there are more formal processes for that, with NIST that isn't a particular thing that directly exists, but you can still show an organization. You can show, for example, a third-party organization, your compliance through summary reports, letters of attestation from security providers. There are still ways to show your overall level of maturity without an actual certification per se.
Okay, but you don't go and get certified and post that somewhere, right?
No, that doesn't exist for the NIST framework.
Okay, gotcha. Another question is, how can we leverage NIST 2.0 to meet other compliance requirements? For example, SOC, SOC 2, PCI, etc.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the things that I would say there, again, the NIST CSF is a very strong base. It's not going to cover everything, but it's inclusive enough that you can use it to build out your program and then layer on additional elements. There's an awful lot of these subcategories that your implementations will cover PCI, because again, NIST is asking, how are you protecting different types of data? What is your sensitive data? And if you go back and look at the PCI requirements, this is all going to be things that are asked. It's just asking it specifically about cardholder data. For SOC, if you go to the trust services criteria, there's an awful lot of overlap between the more technical controls and what you'll find in the NIST CSF. And actually now with 2.0, even some of the more management-focused elements, things like how does the board of directors handle cybersecurity? You see these elements now showing up in this new govern function, so there is a lot of overlap. So if you don't have any current substantial other requirements, but you think you might in the future, like you might start taking credit card information, or you may want to pursue a SOC 2 audit in the future, starting with the NIST framework gives you that base, and you can grow from there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So thank you. That's a good question too. Okay, waiting for some other questions. Nothing right now. Do you think? I'll throw out a question myself that I thought about. Another one. Here's actually a good one. This is a good one. Does the new NIST, so does NIST 2.0, does it address AI, or how does it address AI, artificial intelligence?
Unfortunately, it doesn't address it directly. I wish it did. NIST has taken an approach, and we've actually seen this across a wide range of other compliance frameworks. ISO is doing something very similar. AI is being built out as its own category because it is moving so rapidly, because we're still assessing how best to deal with it within organizations because of this rapid change. That, for example, on the NIST side, they've released the AI risk management framework. It's its own independent thing. It uses some of the core elements that you would see within the NIST CSF. For example, there are, I want to say, 4 different functional categories there covering the governance of AI systems, how you map them, how you manage them. Similar concepts of cybersecurity, but just applied to AI. And on the ISO side, this is also true. We have the 42,000 series now being developed, being kept independent of the other cybersecurity elements. All of the core concepts still apply, but for right now, it seems like these large bodies are looking at them independently because of the rapid change. But I do expect we'll see a lot more integration over time.
Okay. Yeah, obviously, AI is a hot topic these days, right? So understanding that. Do you think government agencies will start to mandate CSF anytime soon?
So across the board for all organizations, I would say likely not. I would love to see some more centralized regulation come out of the federal government about this, out of Congress, for cybersecurity protections in general for organizations. Right now, we just kind of have this disparate state by state patchwork of different privacy legislation. But I would say that if the federal government was going to pursue something like that, then NIST CSF would probably be the base that they would work from. And again, as I'd mentioned earlier, for anyone who is adjacent to government agencies, you'll likely be pushed on in one form or another to start adopting some of these controls through, for example, security questionnaires, certain contractual mandates, if not being outright required to have it. And for actual government agencies, it's out. It is something that those organizations need to be complying with.
Yeah, and so something that we run across a lot right now is the CMMC, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of anyone who does business with the U.S. government or the federal government is we have that CMMC coming down. Is there a correlation between the CSF and the CMMC?
Yes and no. So the CSF itself, again, it provides that broad base, but with the CMMC, it's using a different set of controls as its base. The CSF is based largely around one of NIST publications, 800-53, which covers a wide range of security controls. 800-171 is focused around the protection of what's known as controlled unclassified information, CUI. And so there's a lot of overlap again between these two, but they are different. They are different elements. But much like we had mentioned earlier with things like PCI and SOC 2, if your organization is already using the NIST CSF as a base, you'll be in a good position to then look at the additional elements required by 171 and implement those within your environment.
Yeah. So the CSF is a good foundation. That's good. Thank you. We've got more questions came in. So one of them is, how long do you think it would take a mid-size organization, say 500 employees, to implement 2.0? It's a good question.
It is. Assuming that you had really nothing in place, which, if your company sprang up out of nowhere with 500 employees, just to put it out there, I would say it may take you as long as a couple of years. But again, it's going to depend on what your organization's needs are, the type of information you're protecting, and what you need to do for your business objectives and what other compliance regulations you have. But building out a program properly takes time. There's a lot of controls that have to be implemented. There's policy to be defined. There's training to be done. And these are things that just don't happen overnight. You need to build them, you need to grow them, and the organization has to adapt both culturally and within its business processes to fit that model.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the values to an organization like Tangible, right? Partnering with somebody who knows the regulations, knows how to interpret them, and help you develop that roadmap, so you can start putting, timelines. You can start putting allocating resources, putting budgetary costs associated with that, so you know what this is going to cost you, instead of just piecemealing, adding stuff on when it sort of pops it or rears its head, in that journey. Yep,
absolutely. Doing it again piecemeal, bit by bit, like that, without a managed and prioritized approach, you're going to spend more money, and it's you're going to have a lot of ad hoc components to try to integrate.
So here's a question, and I think you kind of touched on this earlier. Said, how should IT approach management and legal about the govern function? I think this talks about that cross-functional relationship and tension between different departments or stakeholders.
Right. I think the main thing is to go at it plainly, and when IT is approaching these, for example, senior management, having these conversations, speak their language. Look at it from terms of business risk. Say, if we don't implement these controls, here's what we stand to lose. Here, again, and you can look at that from the standpoint, financially, but also reputationally. Put it in those terms. You don't have to be extremely technical with it and say, if we don't have XYZ firewall with these additional capabilities, Timmy down the street is going to get in and hack us. I mean, you can use that, but you can phrase it within a way to show what that actually means. How does that affect the business?
Yeah.
And from there, you build all of that out. You build out those functions, and management should be ideally coming back and providing you, as the IT person, with that core framework that you then go and implement.
Yeah, and it really speaks to a culture within the organization, right? So a culture of that, security is not just an IT issue, right? So we can look at the headlines and we can see all these organizations that got hit by ransomware and so forth. Well, that does not affect just the IT department. That affects the whole business.
Yep.
So that top-down culture of security is an IT security or a business enabler. So, if you're in the IT department, helping sort of raise that level of awareness is really a critical part of your duties or your role as well, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So is there another question here and we've got a few more minutes, so I'll probably have a couple more questions. Is there any merit in considering our partners, suppliers to implement SOC or CSF as part of our due diligence? Probably CSF, right?
I mean, let's cover both.
Okay.
So if we look at it from the standpoint of, mandate NIST, sure.
Okay, there we go.
So I would say yes. And I mean, there's no reason why you can't also ask them for SOC. But again, like I said earlier, these two tie very closely hand in hand. But if you have an organization, especially if you're working with a smaller partner that perhaps, or again, a newer company, if you're working with a startup that, may not have been around long enough to go through the full process of a SOC 2 Type 2 audit, because that takes, at least 6 months, if not, longer periods of time to do those evaluations. Having them focus on the NIST CSF as a base is going to, like I said earlier, give them that foundation, let them get off the ground running and build something out that will protect them. And as a result of that, your data, the data that you are working with them with, again, be it customer data, employee data, whatever it is. And so you can use that as a base. And I would say absolutely having contractual language in there to, if not necessarily NIST by name, but mandating some sort, the use of some sort of well-known cybersecurity framework, I think is well worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, and we do see that the supply chain is critical these days, and having, as you mentioned, the appropriate and right contractual vehicles in place to protect yourself and your suppliers is critical to, again, the business.
Yep, absolutely.
So I think that's it on questions. I don't see any more. I'm not sure if I missed any. There's one. Do you think that ISVs that play a key role in supply chains will want to adopt 2.0 to show their customers? I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit.
Yeah, and again, I would say yes, and not just for ISVs, not just for companies building software or whatever it may be, or with a specific product, but any organization that is working with third parties on a regular basis where you're transferring sensitive information. I would say that implementing, again, if you don't have some sort of other core overriding framework requirement, go with NIST. It's just so broadly accepted, so widely understood, especially for a U.S. company. I would say there's really no reason not to use it as your core base, and layer on any other compliance functions that you would have on top of that as they would arise. So yeah, absolutely, I would say everyone should be using it as their core framework. I will say, for companies in Europe, certain other parts of the world, ISO is certainly more widely adopted, more common. But again, there's a lot of overlap between NIST, especially now in the 2.0 framework, and 27001 and 27002. So,
Right.
so you can't really go wrong with either one. But I will also say NIST being a free and open framework has a lot of merit, especially for organizations that are just getting started.
Great. That's great. Anthony, I think we were at the end of our questions there. If you want to advance that slide to that last slide, that gives our contact information, I think.
Absolutely.
But I want to thank you very much for great content, great topic. It was well explained. I'd like to thank all of our audience for taking the time. You all have very busy schedules, so we really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us.